Hi everyone, so today I'm going to show you how to can cranberries. This will just be whole cranberries that you could use later for mixing into any sort of recipe that you have. I actually will be using it for cranberry tart, which I will show you how I make that on a future video. So some of the things you need for canning, you need obviously a pot to can in. This is actually a stainless steel steaming pot, steam canner. You can use it as a regular water bath canner, and in that case all you would do is flip this over. This is the rack that you sit your jars in, and if you wanted to water bath in it instead of steam can, you would flip your rack to work like that. But I prefer to steam can, partially because I have a glass top stove, so I don't want the weight that would have to be there for a water bath canner. In this steam canner, I only have to put water into the level of this rack, whereas a water bath canner, you have to put it all the way up to an inch over your jars, over the top of your jars. So the next part that you have to have for this steam canner, so you'll take this canner, you'll put water in the bottom of it up to that level, and the top goes on like so. I always like to make sure that I put the steam holes in the back so that they're not harming me or anyone else. On top of this canner, you'll see there's a dial that's unique to a steam canner. And what you do is, and this is why I prefer a steam canner, is that you wait until once you put your jars in here with your product, you bring this up to a boil. You put it on high, bring it up to a boil. This dial will start going clockwise. And when it gets up to whatever zone your altitude is in, I'm in zone 1, so I need this dark green outer band. When it gets to that dark green outer band, I can lower my temperature some to maintain it in that green band, but I also can start my timer for my processing. So with a steam canner, in my opinion, it makes your canning more accurate than a water bath canner because of this dial, because of the fact that you can see exactly when your product has gotten up to the temperature instead of the subjective full rolling boil. Well, that's different to every person. It's different to every stove. The timings can be different. So with this, you know when it gets to that line, I can start my time. And every time I come and check on it, it needs to be within that block. If it isn't, then I've done something wrong, my stove's acting wrong, whatever, I need to turn my temperature up. It just allows you to watch it better and be more accurate, in my opinion. So now that I rambled about the canner, these are some of the other things you'll need to have. This is what I consider a jar grabber. I think it's actually called a jar lifter. But this is what you use to grab your jar and move it in and out of the canner and around your kitchen. Obviously a funnel. I prefer to use a metal one over the plastic ones that you see sometimes. Just not a huge fan of the plastic. This is a magnet on a stick, and what you'll use this for is to grab your lids so that you're not touching them. Once you've gotten them nice and clean, they're not clean yet. Once you get them nice and clean, you'll grab them with your magnet, actually, this direction, so that you can then put them on your jar without touching them. And now it's stuck to everything. So you'll obviously need then, of course, your jars, however many you need for your recipe. In this case, I have 7 quart jars. These are wide mouth jars. Really just because that's what I have right now. But I also think with these being canned whole, I think they will stay whole better dumping them out of these jars with the wide mouth than being restricted into a smaller mouth jar. With those jars, you also make sure you inspect them. Make sure you don't have any cracks anywhere. Up here in the tops anywhere in the bottom. These newer ball jars are known to have more defects, so just be careful. Even your brand new jars can have just as much trouble. Then you also need to make sure you have a lid, which this is just your standard ball canning lid. This is considered one-time use. Depending on what I can, I tend to use them more than once. But you need to inspect the inside. You need to make sure that this rubber ring is in good shape. Make sure there's no weird bubbles or deformities or any holes, anything like that. Just make sure it's in really good shape before you reuse it, if you plan to reuse it. This goes on top. Then you'll add your ring, and you need to have each of these for every single jar that you have. So let's get on with getting everything ready. The next thing you'll need to do is make sure everything is very clean. So make sure your jars are washed in nice hot soapy water. These were clean jars out of the cabinet, but I always make sure that I wash them again right before I use them. And I use Lemon Bright. It's a product from Melaleuca, the wellness company. And since I use this type of dish detergent, which also contains tea tree oil, not only am I washing these jars and getting any dirt, grime, that sort of stuff off of them, but I also am disinfecting them, which is incredibly important with canning. That's one of your biggest concerns with spoilage and shelf life, is introducing any sort of bacteria. So the cleaner you can start, the better off you are. I also make sure that I disinfect all of my countertops before I start any of these sort of projects, just to make sure that anything that I may touch is nice and clean. The next step for canning cranberries is to make a sugar syrup. So with cranberries, really just any fruit, especially if you are canning them whole, you need to make sure that you put them in, you don't just want to can them in water. Reason being that your sugar will leach out of your fruit into your water. So then when you drain off that liquid to use the fruit in your recipe, your fruit's going to be very watered down. So for cranberries, they don't contain a lot of sugar. So for this recipe, I'm making a extra light syrup. So there are 10.5 cups of water in this pot, and I've just added 1.5 cups of sugar. And my sugar is yellow because I use the more natural golden sugar. So I have this all mixed together, and the next thing is I'm going to bring this up to a boil. You do not add your cranberries yet. So while this is coming up to a boil, I'm working on the cranberries over here. So I have actually 10 bags of cranberries. I'm going through them and getting any of the bad ones out, any that are shriveled, any that are rotten, just getting the bad ones out and going through them. These 10 bags really they'll probably be more than my 7 quarts that I have here, but I've prepared the sugar syrup and the quarts and all of my canning utensils for doing 7 quarts because that's how many fit in my canner at a time. So if I have more than that, then I'll deal with that when I get to the end. But for now, planning on the 7 quarts. So 10.5 cups of water in here, 1.5 cups of sugar for 7 quarts of cranberries. So one of the other things you really have to pay attention to when you're canning is something called headspace. And headspace is the distance between this lid and the top of whatever you've put in there, whatever liquid, fruit, whatever. So for this recipe, we want a 1/2 inch headspace. So looking at these jars, without having to pull out a ruler all the time, one of the tricks that I use is you actually can use these rings, these threads where you would screw on the top. You can use those as a general guide. So this top one is basically 1/4 inch. This second one is then 1/2 inch, and this bottom is 3/4. So that's what I use as a general guide, instead of having to pull out a ruler all the time and you don't have to be super precise. Just so long as you're close to that, you'll be okay. And the reason you don't want to put too little headspace is because the way that canning works is when you heat up the product that's inside this jar and you have your lid on, you have everything tightened down, as your product inside here gets warm. So when I'm saying product, what I mean is your fruit, your applesauce, whatever it is that you're canning. As that heats up and comes up to temperature in your canner, what it's doing is it's also heating up this little pocket of air that's up here. So what happens, and you'll actually notice it in your canner, is you'll see the button on top of this jar bulge like it is doing now. Now it shouldn't be extreme. You shouldn't get any creases in it or anything like that. If so, something's gone wrong. But just a general bulge like that is okay. That's what you're looking for, because what's happening is as this is getting warm, heat expands, right? So that pocket of air, as well as your product, is expanding. It's getting bigger. So as it's getting bigger, it pushes up on this lid. Now you have your ring on it, so it's tight, it's not going anywhere. So as it pushes up, as it gets hotter, then you reach your canning time. So say you needed it to be 10 minutes. You finish up your 10 minutes. You take your jars out and you put them on a cooler surface. You obviously don't put them on something cold because that will cause a temperature shock and your jars may crack. But as this jar comes out and your product starts to cool, well, what happens when something cools? It shrinks. So your product, as well as the air, now shrinks. So as that shrinks, it creates a vacuum. So this that was bulging up will then get sucked down, and you'll hear that pop. If you don't hear that pop, your jar is not properly canned. It is not sealed. So once that pops like that, this will be super tight. You won't be able to pull it off the jar. I obviously can right now because it's not canned. But once it's canned, it cools down and you hear that pop, you won't be able to lift this up. And that's because that temperature exchange inside the jar has caused that vacuum that has sucked this lid down. There's no glue, there's no tape, nothing like that. It's just a vacuum. So this rubber gasket is sucking down onto that glass and making it stay. I hope that makes sense. I kind of rambled. While my sugar syrup is heating up and coming to a boil, and I already have all my cranberries nice and clean and ready to go. My jars are clean, ready to go. I also like to get my canner started because I will be hot packing this recipe, which means that my cranberries and my syrup, my product inside my jars, will be hot. And since that is hot, I also need my canner to be hot. You don't want to put hot in cold or vice versa because you risk cracking your jars and losing your product. So I have my water in my steam canner up to the level of the top of that rack. Now I'm going to put the top on and let it just sit there. It's just going to, I have it on high, it's going to probably start boiling and just come up to temperature. That way everything that I'm dealing with is going to be the same temperature. Okay, so once your sugar syrup is up to a boil, you're going to add in your cranberries. And I actually will turn my temperature off, that burner off. And I always recommend that you wear long sleeves while you're canning. I know it can get hot, but you will have splashes up onto you. and it's much better if those splash on your clothing than on your arms. And if you notice in the background of this video, you can make out the canner and tell that it is now boiling, so that was perfect timing. I actually will turn that down a little bit because I don't want it to be crazy super hot, because my jars will cool slightly as I'm doing this. So give your cranberries about a minute or two. I see one I missed. And then you're going to shift over to this section. So one of the first things I'm going to do, bear with me a second, is I'm going to take this partial jar of water that I had boiling in the canner, and I'm going to dump it into this bowl where I have the lids and my funnel. That allows those to start warming up. Because I'm going to use warm product, warm jars, put them in a warm canner, I like to go ahead and make sure that my rings are also warm. So they're over here in there getting warm with the funnel. Alright, so we are going to start putting some product into these jars. Alright, so funnel on the jar. I'm going to use this strainer dipper thing to start with. That way I get just cranberries. I'm going to fill the jars with just cranberries first, and then I'll come back and fill them with liquid. Remember, you want to keep that 1/2 inch headspace. So that's going to be probably just right. Let's see. I got a little bit more. Alright, that'll give me about 1/2 inch on that one. And go ahead and start putting them in this one. Like I said, I don't know exactly how many jars this is going to end up making. I know I'll get the 7 quarts, but I think it's going to be more like 9 quarts by the time it's all said and done. Don't be afraid to give your jars a little shake and make sure everything falls down in there properly. These cranberries will, because they haven't really been cooked, they've just been heated up, they will shrink a little bit in the processing. So you will have more space in your jar that will have more liquid, probably an inch or 2. I'll show you when we get all finished. But yeah, so I'm going to carry on filling these up, and I'll bring you back for the next step. I've started adding the liquid to these. As you can see, this now turned red because the cranberries were in there getting warm. So if you look at the jars, obviously this one doesn't have any liquid in it yet. This one does. And you can see at the top the level of my liquid. So my liquid and my product are right here. And that is at the 3/4 mark. I think the recipe calls for at the 1/2 inch, but I think I'm going to go with the 3/4 because these are not fully cooked cranberries, and I am concerned that they are going to expand. Actually, I know they will expand while they are being processed, and I don't want them to bust out of the top. So I'm going to go with a little extra headspace just to be safe. Okay, so now that we have our cranberries and our liquid up to the 3/4 mark, I'm going to go around with a wet paper towel and make sure there's no sticky syrup or cranberry residue on the tops of these jars. Even though I used a funnel, there can still be some that escapes. I know some people will use vinegar for that step. I don't like to do that because I don't trust vinegar against the metal, that it won't create rust and then kill your seal. So the next thing you're going to do is take your lids, which I've got on my little magnet here, and you're going to put those right on top. And as soon as you have it on top, you're going to take your ring and put it on top as well. Be careful because your jars are hot at this point, and you're going to tighten down. People will say finger tight. I say that's also one of those that's hard to judge because everyone's fingers can tighten differently. So I just say tighten down until you comfortably can't tighten anymore. So don't, like, if you're really having to crank on it, you're tightening too much. So I'm going to continue getting these lids and rings on, and then my canner's already warm in the background. So the next thing I have to do with these is simply put them in the canner, and I will show you that in just a moment. Okay, so the next step is getting these into the canner. So I'll take my little can grabber here. Make sure that you grab underneath the rim. Make sure you're actually touching the glass jar, and then pinch tight with your hand and carefully lift it. Make sure you don't have any obstacles between you and your canner that you could potentially hit, and then sit it on a flat surface. So there are little metal supports running across. You don't want to sit it on top of those because then your jar will be crooked and potentially be running into your other jars, and just not a good idea. So this canner, actually most canners this size are only going to hold 7 quarts at a time. So you work in 7-quart batches. It's no big deal. It's actually about as much as you want to do at a time anyways, especially for a beginner. Luckily with cranberries, there isn't a lot of processing. The most tedious part is going through and finding any bad ones and throwing them out. And as you can see, so if you look at this, you can already see a little bit. I don't know if you can see it, but the cranberries are floating a bit in there, and that's why I wanted to make sure that I gave them a little extra headspace just in case. So that's my canner completely full. You can see it's starting to steam. It is thinking about boiling down there. We're not at that point just yet. So I'm going to put my lid back on, and like I said, I'll make sure my steam holes are in the back so that they're not dangerous. And then as you can see, right now my temperature gauge is nowhere near this green line that I need it to be at. So I have my stove on high, and I'm going to let it just do its thing. It may take 5 minutes, may take 10, but I'm going to come back periodically and keep an eye on this gauge. And as soon as that dial gets all the way over here to that dark green line, I'll turn my canner down to low, start my processing time, which in this case is 15 minutes, and then my cranberries will be canning away. Okay, so it's been right at 6 minutes. If you look down in the pot there, we are boiling away. If you look at our gauge, you can see that we are right, I don't know if you can see that. Yep, we are right at the dark green line. So I'm going to turn my temperature down to low, and I know on my stove that the canner will maintain temperature for my 15-minute processing time at low. I don't have to adjust it or keep it up higher than that. I'm able to maintain at that temperature. You'll have to play around with your stove and your canner and see what works for you. So I'm going to go ahead and put 15 minutes on my timer, And this will just keep going. I will come back every few minutes and check just to make sure that I'm staying in that dark green, but I doubt that'll be any trouble. So we're back checking on our canning. We have about 5 minutes left on our processing time. So you can see the dial has moved into the dark green area. That's okay, that's perfectly fine. You just don't want it under that area. Now, you'll notice my pot is now at a much more gentle simmer, and it's maintaining with that burner being on low. Okay, so as we come down to the last few seconds of processing time, there is something else that I forgot to tell you about. So at the end of your 15-minute processing, which this is 15 minutes for quarts or pints, usually that's not the case, but this recipe 15 minutes across the board. But as this finishes up, you'll turn your burner off. And if you're on a gas stove, you can leave your pot where it is. I'm not, so my pot is currently still sitting on the heat. So I need to move it over to a cool space, and it's going to sit there with the lid on with my jar still inside for 5 minutes. And then when that 5 minutes is up, I can take the lid off and start taking my jars out to put them on the counter. And the reason that you do this is, hold on, I'm going to go ahead and slide it over. Okay. The reason that you do this is to prevent siphoning. So siphoning is where your jar changes temperature so rapidly that it actually will cause your product inside to basically, for understanding purposes, boil over. So the rapid change in temperature and pressure will force that liquid out of your jar. So your jar won't explode, but you will have leakage around your lids that you put on, and your liquid will siphon out of the jar, and you'll have less liquid left inside your jar. And this also means that you now will have some liquid between your lid and your glass jar, which means your seal may fail. It may not seal at all. It may seal for just a short period of time, or you may not have any trouble at all. But in my experience, it's best to take that 5 minutes, let everything cool just a smidgen, and then take the lid off, and everything works better. It has now been 5 minutes, so I'm going to take my lid off. And you hear a hissing sound. That's the jars attempting to siphon. Hopefully they aren't actually. And you can see that the lids are bulged up. At least I can see. I don't know if you can see. And then very gently, and again, remember to grab all the way down on the glass. And you can see that these shrunk quite a bit when they cooked. So if you look closely at this jar, you can see where it's bulging up in the center. And as these cool, that bulge is going to suck in. These are super hot right now, so I don't think I'll be able to catch them changing.